During 50 hours, you will be absolute masters of whatever you find beyond the enemy. No one will penalize you for what you do. No one will ask what you're doing. These were the exact words that French General Alphonse Juin recited to the Franco-Moroccan army under his command, authorizing them to commit some of the most heinous crimes against humanity of World War II. We are talking about a dramatic page in the history of Italy, whose fragments are soaked in blood, tears, and unspeakable crimes. Men, women of all ages, and children were attacked, raped, tortured, and murdered. In this video, we will tell you the story of the sinister event known as the Marocchinate. We warn you that the content of today's military history is extremely sensitive. Let's begin. War is always hell, but World War II was pure hell, especially for women. The appalling history of Nazi military brothels, or the mass rape of German women by invading Red Army soldiers in 1945, is well known. However, despite being equally inhumane, or even more so, the brutal sexual assault on Italian women by French colonial soldiers in 1944 is much less known. The Allies remained silent about it because the soldiers involved were their own troops, and they couldn't afford to tarnish their heroism narrative. As the saying goes, history is written by the winners. Nevertheless, witnesses do not forget the horrors of those days, and the wounds are far from healing, as seen below.
Nella notte si sentivano I lamenti di alcune giovani che erano state prese.
Ho sentito, noi stavamo dentro una galleria, delle persone, delle donne gridare: aiuto, aiuto.
Si lamentavano e chiamavano I congiunti, è una cosa straziante, una cosa che io di notte sentire queste voci.
Marocchinate is the term used to recall the mass rapes and killings committed in World War II after the Battle of Monte Cassino by Allied troops. The French Expeditionary Corps on the Italian front consisted of 130,000 Moroccan, Tunisian, Algerian, and Senegalese men from French colonies in North Africa. Among them were the most fundamentalist, known as Goumiers. In total, there were 7,833, wearing the characteristic Arab burnous, a green woolen tunic with multicolored bands and rope sandals. They also carried the typical curved dagger, called kumia, on their belts, with which they cut the ears and noses of killed enemies to make necklaces. Their commander was the ambitious General Alphonse Juin, born in Algeria, who, from being a collaborator of the Nazis, had switched to working for the Allies. By July 1943, with the Allied landing in Sicily, the rapes by Moroccan troops were already a habit. They only briefly stopped when the Allies, advancing through Italy without much difficulty, got stuck in Cassino, in the Gustav Line, where the Shermans offered very stubborn resistance. It was French General Juin who proposed surrounding the enemy fortress of Mount Petrella, east of Cassino, which the Shermans had left partially undefended. In those areas, only his Moroccan mountain troops could have survived. The Goumiers knew they were a discredited shock force, a kind of horrendous suicide squad that no one respected, so they could behave like beasts with their enemies and prisoners. That's why, knowing the savagery these troops were capable of, the Shermans warned the civilian population of Ciotiaria of the danger with an aerial pamphlet drop encouraging them to flee in May 1944. Imagine having to leave your home suddenly because a paper falling from the sky says that your life and your family's life are in grave danger due to the arrival of troops that are supposedly there to liberate you from fascism. Many children were evacuated by the fascist National Republican Guard and sent to the colonies of Rimini, but most of the civilian population took refuge in tents and carts on the Pollica Plateau, a medium-sized plateau just below Mount Petrella. However, what ended up happening was much more serious than the worst nightmares of the locals. The villagers still remember with horror some of the scenes they saw and experienced firsthand.
Una mia congiunta che aveva gli orecchini, questi mascalzoni, uno di questi ce li strappò, proprio ce li strappò i pianti per il dolore.
On May 14, 1944, Allied troops advanced, breaking through German defenses, reaching Monte Cassino, which would be captured on May 18th, concluding the Battle of Monte Cassino. The next night, a division of thousands of Gumier left their camp, traversed the mountain slopes surrounding cities and villages in the Xiotsi area region. After General Guin's rallying cry, the men felt empowered to unleash hell on dozens of villages in the area, without any kind of control or humanity. The Moroccan soldiers first selected the most beautiful girls from each village to rape them in groups, with long lines of soldiers waiting their turn in front of each one, while others held the victims by the wrists and ankles. Many times, these were girls who weren't even teenagers, as this chilling archival material recounts.
Io vedo mia sorella che per le gambe c'aveva il sangue. Io dissi mamma, dici mamma che ha fatto Flaminia? È caduta.
In an Italian village, the Moroccans raped 30 women and 2 men, and in Valamayo, 2 sisters, aged 15 and 17, were forced to sexually satisfy a platoon of 200 Gumiers in an act of unprecedented cruelty and inhumanity. After the horrendous act, having been abused for hours, one of the young girls died, and the other had an incurable psychotic breakdown, spending the last 53 years in an asylum.
A papà.
Military reports describe the typical methodology of the Gumier. The Moroccan soldiers knocked on the door, and if it wasn't open, they would break it down and beat the victims with the butt of the musket on the head. After the person fell unconscious to the ground, they physically carried them about 30 meters from the house and raped them while other soldiers dragged, beat, and tied their relatives to a tree to watch everything. The terrified onlookers couldn't offer any help to the victim, as they were forced to watch the gruesome spectacle at gunpoint. Many times the victims were underage boys and girls. Just like this report, over the years, a lot of documentation and testimonies have surfaced, allowing the reconstruction of the unbearable events. From the numerous documents collected today, we can say that there were at least 20,000 cases of rapes. However, this figure does not reflect reality, as several medical reports from the time warn that only a third of the raped women managed to overcome their unjustified shame and had the courage to report it. Specialist projections maintain that there were a minimum of 60,000 raped women, many of whom suffered abuses repeatedly and by more than one perpetrator. Recovered medical reports corroborate the brutal nature of the Allied troops, indicating anal and vocal cord lacerations due to the violence of sexual attacks. There are also reports of broken teeth to prevent the victims' bites, impalements, and castrations, especially reserved for men who tried to defend their wives, mothers, or daughters, although mutilations for the mere amusement of the Franco-Moroccan soldiers were also widespread. Sexually transmitted infections, such as syphilis, gonorrhea, and other diseases, became another tragedy experienced by the communities, causing thousands of deaths. Moreover, thousands of women became pregnant. Of these pregnancies, only a few survived, as women attempted home abortions to erase any evidence of the atrocities they had endured. After the war, the Veroli orphanage welcomed about 400 unwanted children born from those forced unions. From documents in the Central State Archive, it emerges that white French soldiers also participated in the unrestrained violence, and it was not an ethnic issue. Considering that European French represented 40% of the entire body of soldiers, it is limiting to attribute the responsibility for the rapes and atrocities solely to the Moroccan Goumiers. However, this is not addressed by the French people, who disassociate themselves from all responsibility, and when the topic is approached, imply that it was the behavior of a certain population, with a clearly racist focus. An English report reveals that soldiers of French origin, with no connection to Moroccan or Algerian roots, raped a vast number of women and girls in broad daylight, sodomized thousands of prisoners, and castrated the leaders of the region's villages. The victims of rape ranged from 7 to 86 years old without distinguishing gender, social status, or ethnicity. Both children and adults, as well as the elderly, suffered the brutality of the Allied troops. While many have sought explanations for such violence, the reality is that nothing can justify, even partially, what happened. It was simply an act of criminality and savage brutality, inhumanly perpetrated by a group of men given permission to do whatever they wanted without facing any consequences. The number of deaths is very difficult to calculate, but is estimated to be in the tens of thousands. It is also impossible to count the many women and men who, as a result of the inhuman events experienced, could not marry or lead a normal life, leading them to commit suicide or become clinically insane. All victims agree on one thing: dying without suffering would have been a gift.
Pensavo di morire, sì, dico, mo mi ammazzano, se mi ammazzavano forse era meglio che finiva via.
Come a Gesù Cristo quando li portavano, tenevano fragellemme, mi hanno fatto in quella maniera a me.
Io mi stavo aspettando il colpo mio, ero ragazzina, però stavo aspettando il colpo mio, proprio mi credevo, ci credevamo che ci ammazzavano tutti quella sera.
During World War II, prostitution experienced significant growth, either through the establishment of infamous militarized brothels or the creation of establishments even within concentration camps. However, the Soviet Union took a contrary stance, adopting an increasingly harsh position to combat what they considered a degeneration inherent in capitalism. From the mass closure of establishments to the persecution and execution of sex workers, Soviet methods were brutal. The issue was that the Axis forces were avid consumers of such services, creating a hostile atmosphere in the conquered Soviet territories. In this new video on military history, we want to take you on a temporal journey to understand why prostitution was taboo in Russian lands, and how the oldest profession in history continued to survive illegally under Stalin's government. In Moscow, prostitution was permitted for almost 75 years, between 1843 and the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. In the ancient city, the heart of the Tsarist Empire, there were all kinds of sexual services. First-rate brothels offered group sessions for an hour for a total of 15 rubles. For the more demanding, at the price of 7 rubles per person, one could access the popular carnal game known as Nanny, Hurt Me More. We won't delve into details, but considering the name, you can surely draw your own conclusions. These services were intended for the powerful and wealthy, while the common people frequented second-rate brothels, where a few rubles were paid for a private encounter of half an hour. Finally, for the most desperate, there were third-level establishments where, for 50 kopecks, equivalent to 1/100th of a ruble, one could hire the services of a lady. For a more everyday reference, this was equivalent to the cost of a dozen eggs. Considering this well-established sexual economy, one wonders how an ancient empire came to allow such consumption. In Imperial Russia, prostitution became legal through a decree issued by Nicholas I in 1843. This wasn't due to widespread promiscuity, but rather a method of sanitary containment. In many ways, it was a reaction by authorities to massive outbreaks of diseases, such as syphilis and other genital infections. Posters from the time depict widespread panic about diseases that, for many, were a result of casual sex. The last one reads the phrase casual sex, the main source of venereal diseases. In response to this crisis, doctors called for measures to reduce the number of cases, and the only viable way was to have control over brothels, inspecting the sanitary conditions of the place and the women working there. This document is one of those handed to sex workers, with their physical condition and corresponding signatures. This mechanism closely resembles that employed by the Third Reich in Europe during its massive expansion in World War II. Fearing sexually transmitted diseases that decimated their ranks and possible homosexual relationships among soldiers, Germany initiated a network of militarized brothels. One of the most famous was Salon Kitty, located in Berlin, which served as both a brothel and a spy center. At the top of this establishment, girls seduced important men who, in moments of weakness or pleasure, revealed secrets of great importance to the Reich. The entire place was wired, and through cables, information reached a recording room below. Of course, not all places were as sophisticated. Typically, establishments operated in old houses that, in many cases, had been brothels before the Nazi occupation. However, in these rooms, German girls did not sleep. Instead, young slaves from ravaged communities, mainly Polish, were forced into violent encounters with soldiers. Roma and Jewish women were not eligible for this work, so they were sent to forced labor camps. Later, we will see in detail how this sexual policy functioned during the German campaign in Soviet territory. Now let's return to the Eurasian giant. Russia is a vast country both horizontally and vertically, to the extent that this expanse has been one of the main challenges to overcome for those in power. The first medical and police committee was established on Kolbovsky Street, and officials posed a question: why traverse the entire city when interested parties could be asked to come to the organization? Thus, the first permits granted to brothels stipulated their installation a few meters from the committee's building, in the infamous Sretenka district. According to preserved data from 1874, out of 152 households, 97 were brothels. These were the faces and bodies that the clientele found there. Earlier, we detailed the 3 types of services that a Russian citizen could access, and incredible as it may sound, these 3 levels were devised by none other than Tsar Nicholas Thurser. Realizing that a high-ranking official would not want to sleep in a bed where a mere soldier had just slept, he divided brothels into 3 categories. The first can be compared to a VIP lounge, a private club accessible only to wealthy personalities. Young women from Germany, Poland, and the current Baltic countries were recruited for the services provided there, forming a kind of Tower of Babel in the heart of Moscow. The prostitutes spoke several European languages, played music, and could engage in any conversation. Regarding sexual health, a few salons offered condoms, but these were neither cheap nor hygienic as, before the invention of latex, they were made from animal intestines or tissues. These condoms were not easy to use and did not provide protection against sexually transmitted diseases, so they were not popular among men. In first-class institutions, there were mainly young women from the city, and in third-category institutions, there were mainly girls from the humblest villages. What they all had in common was that the harsh life of a prostitute significantly affected their health. Medical checkups were barely a bureaucratic matter aimed at ensuring they did not have syphilis and similar diseases. No one cared if they were malnourished or dying from chronic alcoholism. To endure the work, Russian prostitutes drank 4 glasses of vodka in the morning on an empty stomach. During the day, the dose increased, aiming to stay drunk and confused to pay little attention to their harsh reality. All these hardships continued until 1917, when the most radical revolution in history erupted in the heart of Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution completely abolished this system, arguing that phenomena like prostitution and drug consumption were worrying symptoms of capitalist decadence. However, Under Soviet noses, sex work continued to exist, albeit illegally. The most important policy to eradicate the phenomenon was the establishment of treatment centers, where women were provided with medical assistance and vocational education so they could embark on a new career in one of the many cooperatives that emerged after the 1917 revolution. This led to a significant reduction, almost to the point of extinction, of prostitution in the regions where these centers operated. However, once again, the size and extent of Russia were a problem, as this policy affected only about half of the women engaged in prostitution. In 1919, a forced labor camp for women was established in Petrograd. There, around 6,500 prisoners endured the hardships of Soviet prison life, with 60% accused of prostitution, by then a crime punishable by imprisonment. Simultaneously, efforts continued to rehabilitate some prostitutes considered victims of the capitalist system, leading to the establishment of the Commission to Combat Prostitution in 1919, an agency under the People's Commissariat of Health. In 1929, a system was introduced where prostitutes were sent to special forced labor institutions for re-education. In case of relapse after a stay in these camps, they were sent to more brutal detention centers intended for criminals and enemies of the state. In the early years of the 1930s, suspicious foreign women engaging in prostitution were deported to their home countries, although over time all captured women were imprisoned in facilities with varying levels of police control. The next significant step in this persecution process occurred with the onset of World War II. As part of their military advance strategy, Axis countries often established militarized brothels. We've already explained the German situation, but the Italians were also part of this sexual domination process. The images you just saw correspond to the Italian advance on Russian territory. During the Italian campaign in the Soviet Union, Mussolini's soldiers formed relationships with Russian women, despite constant instructions from authorities to avoid any contact with the local population for security and hygiene reasons. Some Axis soldiers even engaged in cohabitation, forming romantic relationships with Soviet women. To prevent these problematic situations, Italian authorities also favored the installation of brothels, regulated in a military manner, allowing for health control but also avoiding excessive contact between troops and local women. Beyond believing that a soldier in love might be more prone to cowardice, there was also a fear of espionage. In many cases, the concern was that these women, who won over Axis men, might be seeking information or moments of weakness to collaborate with the Red Army. Historians have had difficulty reconstructing the activities of the Italian army in Soviet territory, since much of the material preserved from that time perpetuates the image of the good Italian, the respectful and romantic invader who treats his conquered well. In many cases, the love stories recounted by Italian troops returning to their homeland were actually tales of encounters with prostitutes or abused young women. The Germans had a similar experience to the Italians. Although the establishment of militarized brothels, one of the trademarks of Nazism, proved to be a challenging task. On the one hand, the hatred of Soviet peasants towards the Germans was too great to fraternize, and on the other hand, there were not many pre-existing brothels in operation. Remember that the Reich took advantage of already open establishments and experienced prostitutes, but in Russian territory, this was not possible due to the government's prohibition of the activity. Unfortunately, unable to channel their sexual frustrations in exchange for money, German soldiers carried out brutal crimes against women in conquered areas. This was a brutal contrast compared to the French case, where, before the German invasion, a large number of brothels were operating and were later taken over by military services. That's why it is often said that, in French territory, sex work experienced a golden age during World War II. Similarly, relationships between French women and Axis soldiers were much more common. In the Soviet case, romances with German soldiers were much rarer, although, after the war ended, these women were persecuted and humiliated, with the same brutality across Europe. What you're seeing on the screen is not a witch hunt, but the punishments received by French prostitutes who had relationships with Germans during the occupation. In Russia, such images were not seen, but there was contempt for traitorous sex workers. And in many cases, it ended with women imprisoned in forced labor camps. Some Russian girls voluntarily married officers, officials, and soldiers of the Wehrmacht, either out of love, convenience, or a strange Stockholm syndrome. That's why in 1942 a circular from the NKVD of the Soviet Union appeared, recognizing women who had sexual relations with the Nazis as prostitutes and traitors, crimes punishable by death or perpetual stay in one of the Siberian gulags. NKVD department heads had to start their work in liberated territories by arresting protectors and collaborators of the Germans, including brothel owners. Many girlfriends of Germans were punished both socially and politically, being sent to detention centers or expelled from their communities in shame. However, not all Russian women went with the Germans willingly. Some of them followed orders from the Soviet command and collected intelligence with notable success. The suspicions of Axis officers about the danger of espionage were partly true. When World War II concluded, prostitutes once again became a shame for the socialist ideal. The topic was considered taboo for the Soviet Union, which is why newspapers and intellectuals of the time did not write about it. Such was the ideological denial that it was not until 1980 that the term was included in the Soviet Encyclopedic Dictionary, defining prostitution as an evil that arose in anti-socialist societies and spread due to capitalism. Nevertheless, ideological denials did not prevent the existence of prostitution in the Soviet Union, especially in the more marginalized regions where urban progress did not reach with the same intensity. The black market for sex work flourished in various forms, such as vacation resorts where, with room rentals and room service, the company of beautiful ladies was included. The growth of these types of businesses increased during the 1970s, when some economic crises resulted in the impoverishment of a large part of the female population, forcing them to resort to extreme methods of survival. As you can see, prostitution is a global phenomenon with various facets, whether in refined brothels for the bourgeoisie or in militarized establishments where young women are little more than animals. The sex trade has constantly changed, adapting to the historical context. The same happened in the Soviet Union, from the total acceptance of prostitutes to their persecution as criminals. It is true that Japanese imperial troops have been known for their perversion and cruelty towards the women of their enemies. However, the treatment that the Allies gave to Japanese women during World War II is not to be overlooked. While it is a taboo topic for Americans, their militias were as depraved as the Japanese, especially in two historical moments in the most significant conflict of the 20th century. In today's video, we will discuss a history that some Allied sources have tried to silence, but continues to come to light with chilling testimonies and studies. We want to share with you the atrocities committed by American troops during the Battle of Okinawa and the subsequent occupation of Japan. The material we are going to share is of a sensitive nature, so make sure to be accompanied when watching this video. Welcome once again to Military History. Let's begin.
We debarked from our ships. We landed in Okinawa and we had no idea of what kind of resistance we will encounter. There were no Japanese, there were no natives, there was nothing. We made our way immediately to the airport that had been deserted by the Japanese, and we found a good many destroyed planes and bombs, but no resistance. By the end of the second day, we had crossed the island, and that was when our trouble began.
These striking images are from the well-known Battle of Okinawa, fought brutally for 82 long days, from early April to mid-June 1945, remembered for the ferocity and brutality of the fighting. The intensity of the gunfire and the massive number of Allied ships and armored vehicles assaulting the island resulted in one of the battles with the highest casualties, both civilian and military, in the entire Pacific campaign. According to official estimates, the total number of deaths exceeds 250,000. The main objective of the operation was to seize the large island of Okinawa, only 550 kilometers away from Japan, and deliver a moral blow to the empire, planning to use it as a base for air operations with the intention of invading Japanese territory. Despite the success of the island's occupation, the crimes and atrocities committed by the Americans in this military venture remain controversial to this day. Okinawa had a high indigenous civilian population not involved in the conflict, which was devastated by Allied troops. While the exact count is uncertain, it is estimated that the landing left nearly 150,000 innocent people dead due to artillery fire, air raids, and even counting executions carried out by the Imperial Japanese Army. American militias reported that during the battle, it was difficult for them to distinguish between civilians and soldiers. A testimony from an infantry soldier is illustrative and terrible. They shot at us from their small houses, but we couldn't distinguish which ones were occupied by civilians and which by soldiers. It was terrible not being able to distinguish between the enemy and the women and children. At some point, we stopped caring and started firing indiscriminately. We didn't know whom we were aiming at, we just shot. Despite the images we saw and the horrifying testimonies, being shot by enemy weapons was not the worst fate that could befall the civilian population of Okinawa. Rumors spread by Japanese imperial troops about the savage Americans and the torments they would subject the locals to led to mass suicides among the population, with the imminent victory of American troops. An article published in the Ryukyu Shimpo, one of the island's two main newspapers, revealed in 2007 that many Okinawa residents declared that the Japanese army directly forced them to commit suicide. Not only that, but witnesses also claimed that they were given grenades to self-immolate and attack the Americans. Another group of civilians, inundated and indoctrinated by Japanese propaganda, not only committed suicide, but also killed their families to avoid the supposed abuses that the barbaric soldiers of the United States were going to subject them to. Many of them tragically threw themselves along with their families from the high cliffs where the Peace Museum is currently located. However, despite the terror spread among the locals, being a strategy of the Imperial Army to incite the locals to revolt against the invaders and fight against them, it seems that many of the rumors were far from mere propaganda. War crimes committed by the United States have always been a controversial topic, given the limited records of the events. In this case, a group of historians has estimated that American soldiers committed more than 10,000 rapes during the 3 months of this battle. Marine Corps officials in Okinawa and Washington have stated that they have no knowledge of any rapes committed by American soldiers in Okinawa, and their records do not indicate that the Marines committed any war crimes. However, the rapes committed in this operation are another of the dirty secrets that American military chronicles choose to suppress from historical reports. The testimonies are few but abhorrent, as local women did not dare to report the incidents at the time. few residents of Okinawa became pregnant as a result of the attacks, as stress and poor nutrition made most of them infertile. Those who did become pregnant aborted before their husbands and fathers returned from the war to avoid being considered a disgrace to the family. The precarious methods led to many of them dying in the process, burying the war crime forever with them. Among the most terrible incidents resulting from these crimes is the murder of newborns conceived by Americans. Many babies were drowned or poisoned by their own mothers to avoid carrying the shame of rape. An episode recounted by some historians briefly summarizes these heartbreaking acts. In a village on the Motobu Peninsula, where there were only women, children, and the elderly, as all the young people had been mobilized for the war, the tragedy unfolded. Shortly after the landing, the Marines searched the village but found no signs of Japanese forces. Taking advantage of the situation, they initiated a game called Hunt Women in broad daylight. They literally chased them through the village while they hid in huts or nearby air raid shelters. They were pulled out of their hiding places one by one and systematically raped by groups of 5 to 10 soldiers before being released. The game resumed the next day. While Americans have a very biased view of war crimes committed in Okinawa, it is undeniable that the Japanese themselves perpetrated similar atrocities against that population. It is noteworthy that the Imperial Army considered the island natives an inferior race, as they did with the Chinese or Koreans, implying that racial supremacy lay in Japanese lands. Japanese militias executed all Okinawans who refused to collaborate with them to face the enemy, either by fighting or providing them with food and provisions. They even looted villages as brutally as the Americans. This led to deaths not only at the hands of the Imperial Army, but also due to the famine of entire villages left without food due to the attacks of Japanese soldiers. The rape of civilians in Okinawa was an act in which soldiers from both sides were involved, because once they were defeated, the Japanese made it routine to punish the Okinawan women by sexually abusing them. Finally, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet entry into the Pacific Theater would prompt Japan's surrender just a few weeks after the end of the fighting in Okinawa. One would think that things would end there, but equally dark events were about to happen in Japanese lands. After the official surrender of Japan that we just witnessed, the occupation of Japan took place at the end of World War II and was carried out by the Allied forces, led by the United States with contributions from Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand. The Treaty of San Francisco, signed on September 8, 1951, marked the end of the Allied occupation, subsequently entering into force on April 28, 1952, when Japan became an independent state again, obviously under certain conditions. The atrocities that occurred during this period were considered war violations, that is, crimes of a sexual nature committed under the Allied military occupation of Japan. Concrete estimates of specific numbers and possible subsequent consequences of these events differ considerably, depending on whether one listens to official military authorities or human rights advocates specializing in the subject. While major American newspapers spoke of a peaceful occupation, life in Japanese territory was a nightmare. Next, let's see how the media softened or denied the atrocities that were happening at the time in Japanese lands. In the period following the announcement of the surrender of the Emperor of Japan, many Japanese civilians feared that Allied occupation troops might brutally rape Japanese women when they arrived. Interestingly, these fears were largely driven by the concern that Allied troops would behave similarly to the Japanese occupation forces in China and the Pacific, where unspeakable crimes against humanity were committed, such as the Nanking Massacre, among others. For this reason, the Japanese government and the governments of several prefectures issued warnings for women to take precautions and avoid contact with occupation troops. For example, in Kanagawa Prefecture, where the Americans were expected to make the first landing in Japanese territory, it was recommended that young women and girls evacuate the area automatically. Among the most terrible directives, the authorities in some Japanese towns directly ordered women who were threatened with rape, were in situations of abuse, or had already been violated to commit suicide to honor the moral and spiritual education of the nation. Sometimes it was not the authorities, but their own families who made these recommendations, as in the testimony we are about to hear.
And then also one day when I was coming home from school, I was by myself when I saw a GI in a GI clothes coming towards me. I didn't know what to do. You know, during the war, in my pocket, in the covering over my head, the padded, had all kinds of pockets inside. One of the pockets had cyanide, you know, the powder. If I saw Americans, my mother said that I was supposed to take this white powder. It's better to die than being captured by Americans.
In a desperate attempt to curb the rampant crimes of lust by the Allies, the Japanese government established the Recreation and Amusement Association. Despite the grandiose name, it was basically military brothels trying to prevent mass rapes. Most of the prostitutes working in these places came from other locations, as the Japanese wanted to preserve local women. Although all of them felt repulsed by having sexual relations with the enemy, many women who volunteered to work in these brothels claimed they did so because they felt a duty to protect other women from Allied troops. The closure of these establishments was officially ordered in January 1946, when occupation authorities banned all forms of prostitution, considering it a violation of the human rights of the women involved. There is a truly significant controversy regarding the closure of the brothels. In addition to the political correctness of the Allied forces, it is suspected that there was another operational reason for closing the brothels, namely, the enormous increase in potentially deadly venereal diseases among soldiers. While the closure of these places was supposed to reduce the sexual veracity of Allied troops, the opposite happened. According to specialized historians, the number of rapes and assaults on Japanese women was around 40 per day while the brothels were in operation. After the closure of these establishments in early 1946, the figure rose to an average of 330 abuses per day committed by Allied troops. Unfortunately, only a few incidents of assault and rape were reported to the police by Japanese women, although, in any case, local authorities were partly co-opted by the Allied armies in a harmonious coexistence, as some images we are about to see demonstrate. Some specialists claim that massive rapes occurred during the initial phase of the occupation, with a staggering figure of 3,500 abuses in the first month after the landing of American troops. This number comes from unprocessed reports made in various prefectures of Japan, which is disheartening. These numbers suggest that the actual figure was much higher, considering the rapes that were surely not even reported. While some reports of the time claim that when American paratroopers landed in Sapporo, an orgy of looting and unstoppable sexual violence occurred, official sources from the U.S. military barely speak of a brief wave of crimes committed by officers. However, testimonies affirm that group rapes and other sexual atrocities were a daily occurrence. The violence and brutality of some of these acts caused several victims to commit suicide immediately. It is worth noting that there is very little archival material on this topic, as there was strict Allied instruction not to address these issues, even convincing local citizens of this reality, as the testimony we are about to hear demonstrates.
The ridiculous things that I heard, I would say, how stupid, how stupid. They described Americans as such vicious, mean people, and I knew otherwise because I lived it, and I lived with Americans, and we never experienced that kind of thing, even during war.
It is estimated that 2 major incidents of mass rapes were recorded after the closure of the Recreation and Amusement Association brothels. The first occurred near midnight on April 4th, when approximately 50 soldiers arrived in 3 trucks and attacked Nakamura Hospital in the Omori district. Attacking in an orderly and methodical manner, they carried out an operation in which, for almost an hour and a half, they raped more than 40 patients and 37 women from the hospital staff. Some male doctors and patients who tried to protect the women were coldly murdered. However, the worst tragedy was that one of the raped women had a 2-day-old baby in her arms, which was annihilated by being violently thrown to the ground when the troops tried to brutally abuse the woman. The second was a planned and sinister raid on April 11, 1946. The event was led by between 30 and 60 American soldiers who cut the telephone lines to a block of houses in the city of Nagoya to isolate and have them at their mercy. The group of perverse soldiers went house by house and simultaneously raped all the girls and women between 10 and 55 years old in the area. Americans were not the only perpetrators of these atrocities that were dismissed and swept under the rug. Australian, British, and New Zealand troops in Japan, as part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, BCOF, also committed unforgivable criminal acts. Official reports indicate that their members were convicted of just 57 rapes between May 1946 and December 1947, and a few more, 23, between January 1948 and September 1951. However, even if one were to believe the numbers provided by these reports, the penalties imposed on guilty BCOF members were not severe. In fact, the convictions imposed on Australians were often mitigated or directly overturned by Australian courts in most cases, deeming these crimes as typical of the heat of battle. Some written testimonies from that time illustrate the hell suffered by Japanese women. A former prostitute recalls that as soon as Australian troops arrived in Kure in early 1946, they dragged young women into their jeeps, took them to the mountains, and then raped them. Locals heard them screaming for help almost every night. This behavior was common and repeated in most villages, but reports of criminal activity by the occupation forces were quickly downplayed or ignored. Most documents with complaints were returned with the official caption, "Conviction overturned due to lack of evidence," and those records were closed forever. Another heartbreaking testimony comes from Alan Clifton, an Australian officer who acted as an interpreter and criminal investigator during those years of occupation. He bitterly recalls the events. "I stood by a bed in the hospital. On it lay a girl unconscious with her long black hair tousled on the pillow. A doctor and 2 nurses were trying to revive her, but without success. An hour earlier, she had been raped by 20 officers. We found her where they had left her, in an empty lot in Hiroshima. The girl was Japanese. The soldiers were Australian." The moans and lamentations had ceased, and now it was silent. The tortured tension of her face had disappeared, and the smooth brown skin was tight and unwrinkled, stained with tears like the face of a child who had cried himself to sleep. If you wonder how these atrocities could happen without anyone speaking out, it was only possible through a systematic cover-up plan. Not only did the high command of the Allied armed forces work to minimize or make these heinous crimes invisible, but cynically and intelligently, American troops imposed extensive censorship on Japanese media. Look at the photos circulated at that time, suggesting a non-existent camaraderie. There were even newspapers claiming that the ARA brothels were a spectacular business. From September 10, 1945, until the end of the occupation in 1952, local media were forbidden from covering sensitive social issues and serious crimes committed by occupation force members, with particular emphasis on not mentioning rape cases. Some Japanese media were directly collaborators of the Allied occupiers, claiming in some news that no crimes or sexual abuses of any kind were being committed. As the years passed, Japan would begin to heal its wounds when Japanese magazines started publishing first-person accounts of rapes committed by American soldiers, taking responsibility for a sad and dark part of their history. War crimes are always heinous and should be judged impartially and punished to the fullest extent of the law. However, there are often few convictions for American militias. Do you think there is usually a biased view of the atrocities that U.S. troops have committed in various conflicts? Leave your opinions in the comments below. That concludes today's video. We appreciate you sticking around until the end and look forward to the next installments of military history.